Welcome back to the deep dive. Get ready, because today we're plunging into some material that's going to completely challenge how you think about the organizations you're part of.
Yeah, it really might shift your perspective.
We're talking about how they really work, pushing back on those, conventional ideas we have about structure, control, and even change.
That's right. We've been digging into an article that takes us on a journey, really. It looks at different ways of seeing organizations, starting with a traditional view, moving through some common frameworks, and landing on a pretty radical alternative.
And our mission, simple. We're here to pull out the absolute must-know insights from this material.
Right.
We want to help you truly grasp the complex, often messy human dynamics happening inside organizations and understand why that understanding is absolutely essential for navigating modern work and actually, well, making things happen.
You know, the image we're using for this deep dive is that water ripple. It's just perfect, I
It
think.
really captures it.
On the surface, an organization can look so structured, so still, almost like a calm pool.
Yeah.
But beneath that surface, it's this constant, interconnected flow of processes. That's the world we're diving into today.
Okay, let's jump right into the puzzle of modern organizations then. We're so used to picturing them as these clear-cut structures, right? Like a blueprint or maybe a machine.
Exactly. And the source material highlights this fundamental tension that's kind of baked into that traditional view.
Yeah.
The balance between trust and control.
Ah, yes.
Trust versus control.
Organizations hire people, ideally trusting them to do their jobs, but then they layer on all sorts of monitoring and control mechanisms.
And that tension is just amplified by the sheer complexity of modern work. There's a pretty striking CEB study mentioned in the source.
Oh, yeah, that one's eye-opening.
It found 60% of employees now have to consult with at least 10 different colleagues every single day just to get their work done.
10 colleagues daily. And it gets wilder. 30%, nearly a third, need to connect with 20 or more.
Think about the sheer volume of interaction that requires. The study showed this directly correlates with work taking way longer.
Right.
Complex IT projects, like 30% slower. Hiring, a staggering 50% slower.
Wow, 50%.
Yeah, even signing contracts drags on 25% longer. It's
It
significant.
feels like we're constantly coordinating, doesn't it? And isn't it ironic? Technology, which was supposed to free us up.
You'd think so.
Email, chat, video calls, it creates this expectation of being constantly available, always on. And that just eats away at, uninterrupted work time.
It absolutely does. And it raises that really provocative question the source poses. Is trust in the workplace actually lower now? Or does technology just make it infinitely easier for organizations to exercise oversight and control in ways they couldn't before?
That's a tough one. Hard to untangle.
It really is.
But regardless of the root cause, there's a real consequence. The source points out that people are literally choosing to opt out of these kinds of hyper-connected, constantly monitored work environments.
Which brings us to the key insight from the source here. You have to reassess trust. It's not just a nice to have anymore.
No, it sounds crucial.
It's fundamental to improving the actual nature of work and ultimately achieving business objectives. If work requires constant coordination, trust is basically the grease that makes it possible. Without it, everything just grinds to a halt.
Okay. So if traditional hierarchy and that focus on control are running into these problems, maybe the answer isn't more structure, but something different.
Exactly.
This leads us to an intriguing idea the source discusses: communityship.
Right. This is a term coined by Henry Mintzberg back in 2009, I believe.
Okay.
He described communityship as the social glue. It's about people genuinely caring about their work, about their colleagues, about their place within the organization, and, the wider world.
Sense of belonging.
Yeah, and that caring inspires more caring in return. It's reciprocal.
It feels like the complete opposite of what Mintzberg calls macroleading, which is that distant, top-down authority, leaders kind of out of touch.
Totally. And you can immediately see how macroleading fuels the problems we just talked about. That demand for information and control from on high that leads to all that wasted time in meetings and emails.
All that coordination overhead.
Precisely. The source points out how effective working time just vanishes because of this excessive drive for communication and oversight originating from that kind of distant macro-leading perspective.
But where leaders do manage to foster a sense of community, where that social glue is strong, the source suggests things can really flourish.
Yes, absolutely. They reference John Harrison's perspective that when employees feel part of a community, you see a happier, more engaged workforce, which ultimately supports a better bottom line.
Makes sense. Happier people, better work.
So if community and collaboration seem to work so well, and we see great examples of it between organizations sometimes, why is it so slow to become the norm within organizations?
Good question. The source dives into a couple of reasons, right?
It does.
The first one seems pretty obvious once you think about it. Hierarchical bureaucracies just aren't built for it.
Not at all. They're designed for authority and reporting lines, not shared caring and fluid collaboration.
The source mentions newer designs like holacracy and sociocracy trying to build in more participation.
Yeah, these alternative structures.
But they often run into challenges and they can become incredibly complex, require tons of documentation, and sometimes get so focused on the process that they kind of forget the people involved.
That's such a critical point, process over people. And the second reason is just as fundamental. For many employees, let's be honest, their primary driver is the wage.
The paycheck. Yeah.
They're not necessarily there first and foremost for a stated organizational purpose. And shareholder demands often create a direct conflict with that broader purpose, or genuine employee commitment, or even caring for the community or customers.
So you have these different, often conflicting drivers pulling at people inside the organization.
Exactly. And the source stresses this is becoming increasingly important because external pressures, like societal expectations about how companies should behave, heavily impact things like recruiting and keeping talent.
Right. People want to work for companies they feel good about.
Which means any attempt to introduce a new way of working or managing must confront the reality of people's actual behavior within the organization, behavior that management often doesn't fully see or understand.
Okay, so if understanding this complex, often hidden, human behavior is key, how do we even begin to approach it? For a long time, systems thinking has been sort of the go-to framework for making sense of organizations.
Systems thinking is definitely valuable, no doubt. It's that holistic approach that views the organization as a system, interconnected parts like pieces of a puzzle. It's used as a philosophy, a framework, a way to diagnose problems.
And the source acknowledges its utility. It's helped people define processes better, understand relationships and impacts, and identify system-wide problems. It gives you a map, kind of.
It does give you a map. But the source also presents a powerful critique, notably from thinkers like Rafti Stacy.
Stacy, right?
They argue systems thinking has an objectifying bias. It talks about entities and boundaries, but it struggles conceptually to explain how those entities and systems emerge in the first place.
So it describes the what, but not the how.
Kinda. The systemic description is useful, definitely, but it's an abstraction, not the lived reality of interaction.
And the critique identifies a couple of problematic underlying assumptions. One is that individuals can somehow stand outside the system they're part of to choose goals or take action, like an objective observer.
Yes, which is tricky, right?
Yeah.
And the other is treating social institutions or structures as if they exist outside the very interaction that creates and sustains them.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
Stacy calls this formative teleology. It's the idea that structures somehow form things causally from the outside, like they're following a fixed blueprint that dictates behavior.
Ah, I see. So the structure comes first and shapes everything.
That's the assumption systems thinking can lean towards. It focuses on observing and redesigning the whole from this outside perspective, but it misses the dynamic, direct experience within that whole.
They briefly mention systems intelligence, too, which tries to get around this.
Yeah, systems intelligence tries to bridge that gap by focusing on what people do right in systemic settings, connecting to the idea of learning organizations, how people adapt and learn within the system.
But even that, for the source authors, doesn't quite capture the full picture.
Right, and this is where the real shift happens. The source moves us towards what Stacy terms complex responsive processes, or CRP.
Okay, CRP. So this is the alternative perspective that moves away from the system idea altogether.
Exactly. The fundamental view shifts. Individuals and organizations aren't seen as fixed systems with boundaries. Instead, they are understood as self-organizing processes of relating.
Processes of relating.
It's a fundamentally different lens, and as the source highlights, it deeply aligns with the work of the influential philosopher George H. Mead.
George H. Mead. Okay. This feels like going back to some foundational ideas to build something new. He was a key figure in social psychology and philosophy.
Hugely influential.
Yeah.
And his work is fascinating because it was actually compiled and published by his students after he died. He didn't publish books himself in this area.
Right.
And Mead's fundamental insight force here is that individuals and social organizations aren't separate things that interact. They're actually different aspects of the same ongoing symbolic interaction processes.
Wow. Okay, so the system is just an abstraction.
Thinking of them purely as systems as an
Mhm.
abstraction, yeah. The underlying reality is this constant flow of relating, of interaction.
So let's break down his core idea of symbolic interaction. How does he describe that process?
He sees it as this constant back and forth of gesture and response. A gesture is like a sign, could be a word, a facial expression, a tone of voice.
Mm-hmm.
And its meaning isn't inherent in the gesture itself. The meaning emerges in the response it calls forth from someone else.
So meaning is co-created.
Exactly. Together, the gesture and response create a social act, and meaning is constructed collaboratively in that act. Every gesture is also a response to a previous one, so communication isn't like passing a package of information.
The sender-receiver model.
Right, it's not that. It's a continuous stream of bodily actions, tone of voice, facial cues, posture, words. It's much more dynamic and, frankly, embodied.
That's a completely different way to think about communication than the simple sender-receiver model most of us probably learned.
It totally is. The source makes a point of this. The sender-receiver model often assumes we have fully formed thoughts inside our heads, and then we just, translate them into words to send.
Yeah.
Mead's model, based on gesture and response, is messier. It doesn't assume those fully formed inner worlds in the same way. It focuses on the interaction itself and how our actions call forth responses in others, and how their responses then influence our next action. It's a constant loop.
And within this, Mead has the crucial concept of the significance symbol. What's that about?
Yes. This is the magical part for humans, really. A significant symbol is a gesture, particularly vocal gestures, like words that calls out the same response or tendency to respond in the person making it as it does in the person receiving it.
Okay, unpack that a little. Same response.
Think about it this way. If I say the word chair, it evokes an idea or image of a chair in you, but it also evokes a similar idea or image in me as I say it. We share a common understanding, a similar response tendency associated with that sound.
Ah, okay. Unlike maybe a dog barking.
Exactly. One dog barks, the other reacts by barking back or running, but they don't necessarily understand the meaning in that shared human sense. Humans, through significant symbols like words, develop the ability to anticipate the other person's potential response because the symbol evokes a similar response or understanding in themselves.
And that ability to anticipate how others might respond, to experience similar feelings or potential reactions internally, that's how humans know what they're doing in a social context, even if it's always a bit uncertain.
Precisely. That shared understanding, built through significant symbols, allows for complex coordination and self-awareness. And this leads directly into Mead's famous concepts of the I and the me.
Right, the I and the me. I remember hearing about those.
The me is essentially our social self. It's how we perceive the generalized other, or society, or the group, sees us. It's the organized set of attitudes of others that we internalize through all this interaction.
So it's the part of us that's aware of social expectations.
Kind of, yeah. And the I is our spontaneous, unpredictable response to that social me. It's our individual creativity, our impulse, our action right now in this moment. It's the part that can surprise even ourselves.
So the actual self is the dynamic balance, the ongoing conversation between that internalized social view, me, and our individual response, I. It's not one or the other.
Never just one or the other. It's a process. And here's the absolutely crucial reciprocal relationship Mead emphasizes. It's not just individuals forming groups. Groups actively mold individuals.
Right, it goes both ways.
Our identity, our self, isn't just something static inside us. It's constantly being formed in our relationships and interactions and our experience of them. Individuals aren't just interacting with each other, they're interdependent in a much more intimate way than we usually think.
Intimate? How so?
They co-adapt and co-evolve, simultaneously constructing themselves, each other, and the environment they are part of through this ongoing process of gesture and response.
Wow. That really shifts the perspective from organizations as static containers, like boxes on a chart, to seeing them as these incredibly dynamic, interconnected, mutually constitutive processes of relating.
And that's exactly what complex responsive processes theory, building directly on Mead, embraces. It's a purely process perspective.
No fixed entities, just process.
Exactly. It describes its causality not as fixed formation, but as transformative teleology, emphasizing the ongoing potential for transformation within the interaction itself, not from some outside plan.
So from the CRP perspective, how do we define this organizational process more specifically?
It's defined as those processes of interaction between human bodies through symbols, just like Mead described. These interactions constantly pattern themselves into recognizable themes in communicative action, like
Hmm.
recurring topics, ways of talking, power dynamics.
Okay, these patterns emerge.
Yes, they emerge, and these themes are perpetually reproducing and potentially transforming right there in the immediate bodily interaction, in the here and now.
And the core insight of CRP, according to the source, is that you can't possibly understand organizational behavior just by looking at the obvious formal stuff, the org chart, the mission statement.
You absolutely can't. The obvious themes are things like written strategies, official plans, formal roles, organizational charts. These are conscious, legitimate, visible. We talk about them.
Right.
But CRP argues these aren't sufficient because they emerge from the non-transparent, informal, often unconscious interactions happening all the time. You have to look beneath the surface at the stuff people don't always talk about or aren't even aware of.
It puts a huge emphasis on the context-dependent, intensely local nature of human action, doesn't it?
Hugely. How I perceive my immediate environment, who I'm talking to, what just happened, influences my response, which in turn subtly changes the environment, affecting how I perceive it next time.
And that includes how I see me, right? How I think others see me in that specific situation.
Exactly, including how you see the generalized other in that specific moment. And critically, everyone's local context, their lived experience of that moment, is unique to them. We're all responding from slightly different places.
Absolutely. The source hammers this point home. Things like organizational values, grand strategies, ideologies, they aren't stored in some central database or policy manual.
Not really, no. They exist, but
They're perpetually being constructed and reconstructed in the public interaction and silent conversations between individuals in the local situations in the living present.
that's the key phrase, living present. It's happening right now in these micro interactions.
Here's where it gets really interesting for anyone trying to lead or manage in an organization. If this view is accurate, well, it means leaders are simply not in control in the traditional sense we usually think.
That's the big kicker, isn't it? It challenges the whole idea of top-down control. Leaders can articulate visions, they can draw up plans, they can redesign structures on paper,
You're
but how those ideas translate into reality across the organization, how they are taken up, maybe resisted, or subtly transformed by people in their local interactions, that's largely beyond the reach of formal controls, incentive systems, or contracts.
The source points out that managers often do manage to get things done, but frequently it's through informal channels, calling in favors, maybe bending the rules slightly, lobbying colleagues.
Yeah, the real work behind the scenes.
But they seem almost unwilling to admit this is how it works, or maybe they don't genuinely understand the dynamic that allowed them to get things done anyway.
CRP takes that question seriously. How do things actually get done around here anyway? It calls for leaders and managers to pay attention not just to the formal plans, but to the everyday actions, the local interactions, what the source colorfully calls the conversational hurly-burly.
Hurly-burly, I like that. So leadership from this perspective isn't about being the master designer standing above it all, or even the steady steward keeping things on course.
No, it's much more involved. It's fundamentally defined as a process of participation in that hurly-burly, in the dynamic, messy, ongoing interaction. Leaders are participants influencing and being influenced.
And this has massive implications for how we think about organizational change, obviously.
Huge implications.
Right. If the behavioral patterns are path dependent, meaning the history of interaction both opens up and closes off possibilities for change, how do you even approach it?
Well, the source contrasts the conventional change model.
Yeah.
Identify the problem, design a solution, implement it top down.
The classic approach.
Yeah. It contrasts that with the view from CRP and also systems intelligence.
Yeah.
Change in this view is much more subtle. It's less about imposing a grand redesign from the outside.
So what is it about?
It's more about recognizing, as systems intelligence highlights, that in most situations, things could always be different. There are always latent possibilities, alternative ways of responding inherent in the ongoing interaction. Change emerges from shifting those local interactions.
And Mead's idea of that mutual relationship comes full circle here, doesn't it?
Beautifully, yes. As you, as an individual, adjust or change your participation in the interaction, maybe you speak up differently or listen differently or respond differently,
Huh?
you subtly affect the patterns of the community, which in turn changes the environment, the generalized other that you are responding to. It's this continuous, mutual cycle of construction and potential transformation. You change the system by changing your participation within it.
Which brings us to the core takeaway, I think, from all the source material we explored today. Organizations are inherently messy. They are incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible, to fully grasp as static, definite systems.
They really are. But you aren't outside observing this mess. You are deeply immersed in it. And simply by being immersed and participating, you are constantly altering what the organization is and what it means in this specific time and place.
So the kind of intelligence needed isn't about standing back and designing a perfect structure from above. It's intelligence operating from within the mess.
Exactly. It's about focusing on intelligent participation in the dynamic local interactions that are already happening. The conversations, the shared work, the bending of rules, the quiet lobbying, all of it. Understanding and working with that reality.
This view, as the source notes, aligns very well with the core approach of organizational development, or OD, which has long focused on making sense of the here and now mess, working with the system from within it, rather than trying to impose change from the outside.
That's a great connection. It's about facilitating emergent change from within.
So we've traveled quite a distance today. From that traditional view of organizations as fixed structures, through the valuable but ultimately limited perspective of systems thinking,
Hmm.
to this really dynamic, process-oriented world illuminated by Mead and complex, responsive processes. It's a fundamental shift from seeing organizations as things to seeing them as fluid, ongoing interactions between people.
It really is a different way of looking.
Yeah,
And it leaves us with something pretty profound to consider for you listening.
yeah.
If the conversational hurly-burly, those informal interactions and local dynamics are truly where things get done in organizations,
Yeah.
what does this fundamentally mean for how you should approach trying to make change happen in your own workplace?
And maybe what kind of intelligence, what kind of awareness and skill is most valuable for you to cultivate in that complex, dynamic environment? Is it technical skill or is it this ability to navigate the hurly-burly?
Powerful questions indeed.
We'll definitely continue exploring these ideas and what they mean for the future of work, design, and management in our next deep dive.
We really hope this deep dive has given you maybe a new lens through which to view the organizations you are part of, and perhaps a new way to think about your own role within them.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.